Perched atop a snowy ridge in Vermont, the hospice was a silent sentinel, flanked by skeletal pine trees and ancient stone walls glazed with ice. The roads that led to it were like forgotten veins winding through the mountain, poorly kept and nearly imperceptible after the snow began its descent. It wasn't a destination people found by accident. They were directed there once every other avenue had been quietly closed. Deep inside, at the very end of the East Wing, was room 311. It was a space that always felt a bit too frigid, a bit too still, regardless of how high the heat was turned or how many warm blankets were layered on the bed. The nurses had dubbed it the quiet room, not for its lack of sound, but because no one ever departed from it with a pulse strong enough to make an echo. This was the room reserved for the unrecoverable, for patients who were no longer spoken of in optimistic tones. They were the ones whose relatives had ceased asking for progress reports and had begun murmuring prayers instead. There was no malicious intent behind it. It was simply the reality of room 311. One didn't come here to be healed. One came here to wait. Even the daylight seemed weaker within its confines, as if it had to stretch itself too thin just to illuminate the bed. It was a location enshrouded in a stillness that was not born of serenity, but of resignation. The staff seldom lingered in the room longer than necessary. They would enter, manage the IVs, check the monitors, and then depart, always with a hand hovering near the light switch, as if some part of them was uncertain of what the darkness might conceal. Her name was Isla Monroe, and only 2 weeks before being moved to room 311, she had been singing in the back of her mother's car, drumming her boots on the seat and tracing patterns on the fog glass with her mittened fingers. That was all before the crash. It took place on a twisting road not far from the hospice itself. Black ice, a bend that was too severe, the crumpling of metal, the shattering of glass. Isla was discovered unconscious within the wreckage, supported by the curve of a seat belt that had done just enough to preserve her life, but not enough to protect her from harm. When she was moved from the intensive care unit to hospice services, her outlook was bleak. Non-responsive, with irreversible damage, the doctor had stated it bluntly, dispassionately, their voices devoid of pain, holding only resignation. She was not going to wake up. That was the official conclusion. Her mother, Evelyn Monroe, offered no argument, not because she was in agreement, but because she lacked the energy to fight any longer. A one-time nurse at the very facility where her daughter now lay, she had resigned from her position months before, as Isla's health declined sharply. Since that time, she had given up asking for news. Instead, she sat, silently, perpetually at her daughter's side, perpetually waiting. She rarely spoke during those initial days in room 311. Not to the nurses, nor to the volunteers, and sometimes not even to Isla. She simply attended to the hiss of oxygen flowing through plastic, to the rhythmic beeping of machinery, and to the profound quiet that occupied the space between each shallow respiration. She would count them. It was the sole thing that made the passage of time feel real. Outside, the snow fell without pause, cloaking the hospice grounds in a white so dense and soft that it seemed to absorb all sound. Inside, Evelyn sat under a donated woolen blanket, her hand wrapped around Isla's unresponsive fingers, and she waited for a signal, a change, for anything that might let her believe in a future again. It was on the 5th night in room 311 that a shift occurred. The snowfall outside had intensified, transforming the landscape into a white silence. Within the room, everything was as it had always been, still, sterile, and suspended in time. Evelyn was in her customary place, curled up near Isla's bed, engrossed in the steady cadence of the machines and her private sorrow when she saw movement down the hall. It was not a physician or a nurse. It was a dog, large, black and tan, drenched from melted snow, with a familiar and powerful build. A German shepherd, clearly identifiable even in the subdued hospital lighting. He padded forward slowly and with purpose, his paws making no sound on the tile floor, as if he knew his destination precisely. The staff at the nursing station glanced up but remained silent. No one made a move to grab a leash. It was as though he wasn't violating any regulations, as if some unspoken permission had been granted. The nurse, Na, rose from her desk the instant she saw the dog. Her immediate reaction was professional and automatic. No animals were permitted in patient care zones. She had upheld that rule countless times. She even took a step into the corridor, her hand partially raised, preparing to either turn the animal away or call for assistance. But then the dog stopped. Right at the entrance to the East Wing corridor, he tilted his head and met her gaze. He looked at her not with fear or defiance, but with something different, an expression that was ancient, composed, and unnervingly calm. Na froze, not from uncertainty about the policy, but because some deep part of her felt as if it had been addressed. In that moment, she let her hand fall. She felt an odd sensation stir within her as he passed, a sudden warmth reminiscent of a resurfaced childhood memory. She did not summon security. She did not radio the reception desk. Instead, she whispered, "Let him pass." And she did. The dog paused for a moment at the entrance to room 311. His gaze surveyed the area, taking in the wires, the beeping equipment, and the girl who was too still to be merely sleeping. He then moved forward, unhurried and unafraid, as if he belonged there. Evelyn did not stir when the dog crossed the threshold. In truth, she saw no cause to prevent him. What was there left to guard? Allah was not returning. That was what everyone had told her. That was what the medical scans had shown. Perhaps this dog, this quiet and serious creature, had simply arrived to bid farewell to another departing soul, to mark the end. And frankly, that seemed appropriate. So Evelyn did not shout or raise her hand or challenge what she was witnessing. She just observed. She let it unfold. She let him come in. Because at that moment, a goodbye was the only thing left to offer. Evelyn looked up, and for a moment, she couldn't catch her breath. 12 years prior, she had raised a German shepherd she named Shadow. He had been her steadfast friend through her nursing studies, through the loss of her husband, and through every solitary night that followed. Shadow had passed away quietly at home just before Isla was born. And now, before her stood a dog that was his perfect double. The same coat, the same posture, the same eyes that appeared to grasp more than they ought to. The dog made no sound, neither a bark nor a whine. He simply approached Isla's bedside, rested his front paws carefully on the bed, and gazed at the child as if he had located what he had been seeking. Then, silently, he climbed onto the bed and lay down beside her. Evelyn remained motionless, not when the dog made himself comfortable on the mattress, not when he exhaled a gentle breath, curling up next to Isla with the calm confidence of one who had done this many times. There was no uncertainty in his posture, no reluctance in his eyes. He was meant to be here. That was undeniable. Her hands quivered as she reached for her daughter's fingers, which were still cold and limp under the bedding. But something had changed. It wasn't just the dog's presence. The room felt lighter, as if the silence was no longer one of waiting, but of listening. She stared at the animal, the set of his jaw, the curve of his back, the dense fur matted with snowmelt. Shadow, it couldn't be him. Yet, everything in her heart told her it was. Memories flooded back without permission. Shadow dozing at the end of her bed. Shadow pressing his nose against her knees when her grief was too overwhelming to breathe. The dog who was more than an animal, a friend, a protector, a constant presence. He had died just weeks before Isla's birth, almost as if he had been creating a space for the child to come into her life. And now this dog was here. Isla stirred. It was barely perceptible, the slightest twitch of her hand where it lay beneath the dog's paw. Evelyn gasped, her eyes fixed on the monitor, then shifting back to her daughter's face, which remained silent. Then came a sound, little more than a whisper. "You came back." Evelyn froze. The words were not directed at her. They had come from Isla, soft, hoarse, and unbelievably sure. Her eyes stayed closed, but there was no mistaking that she had spoken. The dog did not stir. He simply lay there, calm, watchful, present. For the first time in days, Evelyn experienced something beyond fear or detachment. She felt a warmth blossom in her chest, spreading like fire through cold kindling. It was nonsensical, but it didn't have to be, because Isla had spoken and the dog, whoever he was, had heard. Initially, no one believed it. The machines did not sound any louder alarms. The screens did not flash any new warnings. Yet something had changed, not in the data, but within the room itself. The very atmosphere was different, feeling less like a vigil for death and more like holding one's breath in anticipation of a miracle. Isla was still, but the tension in her brow had eased. Her fingers, previously limp and unresponsive, twitched under the dog's paw, just for a moment. Then again, the dog, Coda, did not move or react, but Evelyn witnessed it. With trembling hands, she reached for the call button. By the time the nurses came, Isla's oxygen saturation had climbed slightly, subtly, enough to be noted, but not enough to be explained. Her heart rate was more stable. Her chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, not with labored effort. There were no alarms, no sense of emergency, just a quiet transition from decline to a state of holding steady. The staff observed in cautious quiet. They tweaked settings, double-checked the connections, and cast another look at the German shepherd resting serenely on the bed next to the child. He still wore no tag, no collar, and had no owner. The hospital rules clearly stated that animals were not permitted on patient beds, particularly not in critical cases, but no one made a move to remove him. Later that night, Isla whispered again. It was hardly a full word, yet it was spoken with clear intention. Stay. Her lips barely formed the sound, and her voice was raspy, but she said it, and everyone heard it. And Coda stayed. The following morning, her pupils reacted to light. By midday, she turned her head in the direction of Evelyn's voice. That afternoon, she squeezed her mother's hand. No one called it a miracle. Not yet. The hospice team had witnessed fleeting improvements before, cruel glimmers of hope that ultimately faded. But this instance felt different. It didn't feel like a decline pausing. It felt like a return. That evening, Evelyn sat quietly by her daughter, observing Coda's chest moving in sync with Isla's. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't counting the seconds between her daughter's breaths. It began with the thermostat. Regardless of how high it was set, room 311 remained cold. It wasn't the type of chill that infiltrated through window panes or drafts. This cold emanated from the walls themselves, from the very corners, as if something had seeped into the building's foundation and would not be dislodged. The nurses were the first to notice. They spoke of it in hushed tones during shift changes, mentioning how the lights in 311 would sometimes flicker when the switch was untouched. They talked about how their skin would prickle upon entering, like stepping into a space that was hostile to their presence. Then the sounds started, barely perceptible, like a muffled conversation from an adjacent room, except there was no room on the other side of 311. Some dismissed it as the groaning of pipes or the building settling. Others started avoiding that hallway altogether after sunset. And through it all, Coda remained. He no longer slept through the night. He would sit, vigilant, at the foot of Isla's bed, his ears erect and his body poised. Every night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, he would fix his stare on the same corner, the far left one, where the shadows were deepest behind the heart monitor. He would not move, not blink, just watch. Evelyn noticed it as well. One night, she awoke to see him in that state, frozen and rigid, his gaze locked onto something she could not perceive. When she called his name in a whisper, he did not turn. He didn't even flinch. It was as if he was listening, not for a noise, but for a presence. Then came Isla's voice, soft, lucid, and almost too composed for a child. "He's not sleeping," she stated one morning, her eyes wide open and focused on that same corner. "Who isn't?" Evelyn asked, feeling her heart clench. Isla gave no reply. She simply continued to stare, her hand moving slowly through Coda's fur. The cold did not dissipate. The 7th night arrived without wind or a moon, just the silent pressure of snow against the window panes. Inside room 311, all was still, the kind of quiet that makes one's own breathing feel loud. Isla was asleep, or in a state near to it, her small hand resting gently on Coda's back. Evelyn dozed in the recliner, enveloped in a heavy wool blanket, fluctuating between dreams and a sense of dread. At precisely 3:17 a.m., Coda stood up, not with a stretch or a yawn, but with a clear sense of purpose. His ears twitched, and his body went rigid. He turned to face the left corner, the one perpetually obscured by the monitor's faint light, and this time, he growled. It was a low, deep sound, not of warning, but of defense. Evelyn awoke with a start and sat bolt upright. "Coda," she whispered, her heart beginning to pound. Isla did not stir, but then the lights began to flicker. Once, then twice, before a bulb overhead exploded. A brief shower of sparks fell, and the room was plunged into a wavering darkness. The temperature plummeted. The air in Evelyn's lungs felt like it was turning to ice in her throat, and Isla started to convulse. Her back arched with violence. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her eyes rolled back. The monitor shrieked erratically as her heart rate shot up and her oxygen levels fell. Evelyn jabbed the call button, striking it with her palm over and over, but no one responded. Then Kodo attacked. He did not bark. He did not pause. He threw himself toward the corner with such power that his body hit the wall. But the sound was not of impact with a wall. It was a sound of collision, of meeting resistance. He clawed, barked, and snarled, not at the empty air, but at something unseen, something that was pushing back. The room was filled with the sound of his nails scratching tile and the furious, guttural defense of a creature refusing to let death have its way. And then, just as abruptly, it was over. The monitor stabilized. The lights came back on with a warm hum. The cold vanished. Evelyn found herself on the floor, holding Isla in her arms. She was limp and shivering, but she was breathing. Koda stood between them in the corner, his back arched, his teeth bared, and his tail held stiff. Dr. Ames ran into the room seconds later, out of breath. What happened? No one replied. Isla whimpered, her voice no louder than a breath. He didn't let it take me. The days that came after unfolded in a kind of reverential quiet. Not many words were spoken in room 311, but the silence was no longer heavy with sorrow. It was now filled with awe, because the events that followed were something no one could have foreseen. They didn't need to. Isla was awake. Not completely, not right away, but enough. She reacted to voices. She turned her head toward the window, and she blinked in time with the gentle beeps of machines that were now tracking her healing rather than just her struggle to hold on. And Koda remained. He hardly ever left her side, moving only when the nurses required access. They now worked around him. His presence was no longer questioned. It felt as if moving him would shatter something fragile and beyond replacement. Dr. Ames came back, not holding a chart, but a sealed envelope. It was left at the front desk, he explained to Evelyn. No name, just this. Inside was a faded, sepia-toned photograph. A small girl, no older than Isla, was standing in the snow. Next to her was a German shepherd, with the same markings and the same knowing eyes. On the back, in unsteady pencil, were the words, 1958, room 311. He saved her, too. Evelyn stared. This can't be. Dr. Ames gave a slow nod. I investigated it. Every decade or so, this room has an impossible case. A recovery that no one can account for. And each time, someone makes mention of a dog. No tag, no papers, just him. But why? Evelyn whispered, not truly anticipating a response. But Isla provided one that evening, speaking softly as Koda rested beneath her hand. He doesn't come because of us, she said. He comes because of it. Evelyn turned to face her daughter. The thing in the corner. Isla nodded. It waits for when nobody is looking. He's fought it before, and now he watches so it doesn't try again. Koda did not raise his head, but his ears twitched as if to confirm her words. Isla's recovery moved forward at a pace the staff could not rationalize. In a matter of days, she progressed from being barely responsive to whispering complete sentences. By the close of the first week, she was able to sit up, draw with crayons, and even laugh, a sound that had not been heard in room 311 for many years. Her medical scans showed improvement. Her heart rate became stable. Her body, once deemed beyond repair, seemed to recall the process of healing. Nurses would pause by her door just to observe. They were no longer checking the machines. They were watching her. And Koda was always there beside her, vigilant and calm, like the keeper of a secret no one else could ever grasp. And then one morning, just like that, she was well enough to go home. On the day she was discharged, Isla walked slowly down the corridor, holding Evelyn's hand with one of hers, while her other hand rested on Koda's back. The staff stood along the walls in quiet admiration. There was no party, no great display, just a silence brimming with gratitude. At the main entrance, Evelyn turned. Will he come with us? Dr. Ames just smiled. He came when she needed him most. I believe he will know when it's his time to depart. Isla knelt down next to Koda, touching her forehead to his. Thank you, she whispered. That night, long after their car had driven off, Coda stood once more in the shadows of room 311. He didn't lie down or rest, but simply watched as if he were waiting. Then, without a sound or a goodbye, he turned and padded down the hallway, vanishing into the quiet of the snow-blanketed world outside. Some spirits do not linger. They appear when they are summoned, when they are needed. And Coda still had other doors to watch over.